Hey guys, tonight we're diving into medieval plague doctors and why they wore beaked masks. It's a nightmare. And I mean that literally. Not the quirky Halloween costume nightmare, but the actual soul-crushing, walking through hell nightmare that these people lived through every single day. Forget everything Hollywood told you about these mysterious, bird-faced figures gliding dramatically through misty cobblestone streets. This isn't some romantic Gothic fantasy. This is the real story, and trust me, you probably wouldn't last a day. Hell, you probably wouldn't last an hour. So before you get too comfortable in your climate-controlled room with your hand sanitizer and modern medicine, hit that like button if you enjoy this kind of deep dive, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Are you brave enough to stick around for the full nightmare? We'll see. Now, dim the lights, maybe grab a snack, though you might lose your appetite by the end of this, and let's jump into one of the most terrifying professions in human history. Because here's the thing, when you think plague doctor, you probably picture some mysterious, almost supernatural figure. Maybe you've seen the costume at a Renaissance fair, or spotted the mask in a horror movie. But the reality? The reality is so much worse, and so much more human, than anything fiction could dream up. Tonight, you're going to walk in their shoes. You're going to smell what they smelled, see what they saw, and understand why the mere sight of that beaked mask meant either salvation or death was coming to your door. Ready? Good. Because we're about to time travel to the 14th century, and trust me, you're going to want to come back. Chapter 1. Welcome to Hell on Earth. Picture this. It's 1348, and you've just woken up in what was, until recently, one of the most beautiful cities in Europe. Let's say Florence. Dante's Florence, the birthplace of the Renaissance. Except right now it looks less like the cradle of art and culture and more like the set of a zombie apocalypse movie. You stumble outside your cramped wooden house, and the first thing that hits you isn't the sight. It's the smell. Oh God, the smell. Imagine the worst thing you've ever smelled. Got it? Now multiply that by 1,000 and add the sweet, cloying stench of rotting flowers that people have scattered everywhere, trying to mask the other odors. That's your morning air. That's what you're breathing with every single breath. Bodies line the streets like discarded garbage bags after a holiday weekend, except these aren't going anywhere. The corpse collectors, if there are any left alive, maybe come by once a day, if you're lucky. If you're not lucky, well, you get used to stepping over your neighbors. The rats are having the time of their lives, by the way. They're everywhere, bold as you please, because there's suddenly way more food than they know what to do with. And those fleas on their backs, they're having their own little party, hopping from rat to human to rat to human, carrying their microscopic passengers along for the ride. You try to head to the market to buy food, but half the stalls are empty. The other half are run by people who look like extras from a horror film, pale, sweating, with dark circles under their eyes and that particular look of someone who's seen too much death. The church bells that used to mark the hours with their peaceful tolling, they've gone silent. Not because the bell ringers are taking a break, but because they're dead. Most of them, anyway. The few priests left alive are too busy giving last rites to the endless stream of dying to worry about keeping time. Now, before we go any further, and trust me, it gets worse, I want you to take a moment and really think about this. We're talking about a world where 1 out of every 3 people you know is about to die. Not over years or decades, but in a matter of months, maybe weeks. Your best friend, dead. Your neighbor, dead. That baker you've bought bread from for 20 years, dead. The kid who always played in the street outside your house, dead. This isn't some abstract historical statistic we're talking about. This is complete social collapse. This is watching civilization crumble in real time. And into this nightmare walks our protagonist, the plague doctor. Chapter 2. Enter the Birdman. Now, you might be wondering, who in their right mind would sign up for this job? Who looks at this hellscape and thinks, yeah, I want to get as close to this death plague as humanly possible? Well, here's the thing. Most people who became plague doctors weren't exactly given a choice. Picture yourself again. You're a physician in medieval Europe, which already makes you a rare bird. Maybe you studied at one of the few universities that existed, like the one in Salerno or Paris. You've spent years learning about the 4 humors, bloodletting, and reading the stars to determine the best time to perform surgery. You're basically medieval middle class, which means you're doing pretty well for yourself. Then the plague hits. Suddenly, your regular patients, the wealthy merchants, the minor nobility, the comfortable families who could afford your services, they start dropping like flies. But here's the kicker. The city council comes knocking on your door with an offer you literally cannot refuse. They need someone to tend to the sick. They need someone to examine the dead. They need someone to walk into plague houses and try to figure out who might live and who's definitely going to die. And guess what? You're it. Now, you could try to refuse. You could pack up your things and try to flee the city like so many others did. But medieval cities weren't exactly known for their exit strategies. Most of them were walled, gates were controlled, and good luck getting past the guards when everyone knows the plague is inside the walls. Plus, let's be honest, where are you going to go? This thing is spreading faster than gossip in a small town. It's already jumped from city to city, country to country. Running just means dying tired. So you accept the job. Because you need money to eat, because the authorities basically force you to, and because maybe, just maybe, you actually believe you can help. And that's when someone hands you the most terrifying uniform in human history. Chapter 3, the costume from hell. All right, let's talk about that costume, because that's really what it was. A costume designed not for Halloween, but for walking into literal death. Picture the most unsettling thing you can imagine. Got it? Good. Now imagine it's your work clothes, and you have to wear them for 12 hours a day while surrounded by people dying of the most horrific plague in human history. The beak mask is what everyone remembers, and we'll get to that nightmare in a minute. But first, let's start from the bottom up. Because every single piece of this outfit was designed to keep death at bay. And every single piece was a reminder that death was probably going to win anyway. Your feet go into heavy leather boots that come up to your knees. Not because they're fashionable, but because you're going to be walking through things. Liquids, solids, substances that didn't exist in polite company before the plague hit, that you really, really don't want seeping into your regular shoes. Over your clothes goes a long waxed leather coat that reaches down to your ankles. It's black because black doesn't show stains as much, and trust me, there are going to be stains. Lots of them. This coat is thick, heavy, and covers every inch of your body except your hands and head. Speaking of hands, thick leather gloves that go up to your elbows. You're not taking any chances with accidental skin contact. And then there's the hat, a wide-brimmed black leather hat that sits on top of everything else, giving you the silhouette of something that definitely used to be human, but maybe isn't anymore. But here's where it gets really fun. Everything, and I mean everything, is covered in wax or oil. The whole outfit is basically a medieval hazmat suit designed to create a barrier between you and whatever the hell is causing people to die in such creative and horrible ways. The theory was that disease was carried by bad air, what they called miasma, and if you could keep the bad air from touching your skin, maybe, just maybe, you'd live through your shift. Now, I want you to imagine putting this on for the first time. It's heavy. We're talking maybe 30 or 40 pounds of leather and wax. It's hot, because medieval Europe didn't have air conditioning, and you're essentially wearing a full-body leather sauna suit. It's stiff, because waxed leather doesn't exactly move with your body, and you haven't even put on the mask yet. Comment below if you think you could handle wearing this outfit for even an hour, let alone a full day. I'm betting most of you are already feeling claustrophobic just thinking about it. But the worst part? The absolute worst part is still coming. Chapter 4, Behind the Beak. Now we get to the main event, the thing that turned plague doctors into the stuff of nightmares for centuries to come. The beak. Picture a bird's beak, but stretched out to about 6 inches long, made of leather and attached to a mask that covers your entire face. The eye holes are covered with glass or crystal, the medieval equivalent of safety goggles, so you can see out, but nothing can get in. The whole thing straps to your head with leather ties, creating a seal around your face that makes you look less like a doctor and more like some kind of supernatural creature that feeds on human suffering. But here's the thing that's going to make your skin crawl. That beak isn't empty. Remember, these people thought disease was caused by bad air. So their solution was to fill the beak with good air, or at least air that smelled better than the rotting corpse smell that was everywhere. What did they stuff in there? Herbs, spices, dried flowers, aromatic wood chips, lavender, rosemary, thyme, cloves, cinnamon. Basically, they turned the beak into a medieval potpourri holder. Sounds kind of pleasant, right? Wrong. Because here's what actually happened when you wore this thing. First, you put it on, and immediately you can't breathe normally. That beak forces you to take smaller, more controlled breaths. Every breath you take has to travel through 6 inches of stuffed leather tube before it reaches your mouth. Second, within about 10 minutes, your own breath starts to make the inside of the mask humid and hot. The herbs get damp and start to smell different. Not bad exactly, but not the pleasant aromatherapy experience you might imagine. Third, after an hour or so, you start to feel dizzy, partly because you're not getting enough air and partly because the concentrated smell of all those herbs starts to mess with your head. Lavender and rosemary might smell nice in small doses, but when you're forced to breathe nothing but concentrated herb air for hours at a time, it becomes overwhelming. And fourth, this is the fun part. When you're examining patients, talking to families, or documenting deaths, every word you speak gets filtered through this beak. Your voice becomes muffled, distorted, echoing weirdly inside the mask before it emerges. You don't sound human anymore, you sound like something else entirely. Imagine being a terrified family member watching this creature walk into your house. It's tall, it's black, it smells like a perfume shop. And when it speaks, it sounds like it's talking from inside a tomb. This isn't a doctor coming to help. This is death itself, wearing a costume and carrying a medical bag. Chapter 5. A Day in Hell. Morning rounds. All right, let's walk through a typical day. And by typical, I mean absolutely soul-crushing and traumatic. It's dawn, or what passes for dawn when half the city is on fire and the other half is covered in smoke from the burning corpses. You've managed to get maybe 3 hours of sleep, because that's about all anyone gets anymore. Between the screaming, the crying, the death rattles, and your own nightmares, sleep isn't exactly restful. You wake up in whatever house or building the city has designated as plague doctor headquarters. Maybe it used to be a nice inn, or someone's wealthy home. Now it's just a place where the city's remaining doctors try to catch a few hours of unconsciousness between shifts. The first thing you do, before you even fully wake up, is check yourself for symptoms. Any fever. You feel your forehead, your neck, under your arms. Plague fever isn't subtle. When it hits, you know. Any swelling? You check your neck, your armpits, your groin. Those are where the buboes show up first. Lymph nodes swelling to the size of apples. Hard and painful and absolutely terrifying. Any strange marks on your skin? Sometimes the plague causes dark spots or patches. Sometimes it causes bleeding under the skin. Clear so far? Good. You get to live another day. Now comes the fun part. Putting on the costume. Detailed sensory description. You start with the boots, cold leather against your feet, laces that have to be tied tight because if they come loose during the day, you're not taking the time to retie them. Not when every second of exposure might mean infection. The coat goes on next. Heavy, stiff, still carrying the smell of yesterday's work, smoke, herbs, and underneath it all, the sweet, sick smell of death that never completely washes out. Gloves, hat, each piece adding weight, heat, and another layer between you and the world. And finally, the mask. You check to make sure the beak is freshly stuffed with herbs. You test the eyepieces to make sure you can see clearly. You adjust the straps so they're tight, but not so tight they'll give you a headache. Though let's be honest, you're getting a headache anyway. The last thing you see in any kind of normal way is your reflection in a piece of polished metal or glass. And what looks back at you isn't human anymore. Then you step outside and your workday begins. Before we continue, I want you to really think about this moment. This is the moment when you stop being a person and become something else. Something that parents use to scare their children. Something that makes grown adults cross themselves and mutter prayers. You're not Dr. Smith or Dr. Giovanni anymore. You're the plague doctor. You're the thing that comes when hope is gone. How does that feel? Really think about it. Comment below if you think you could psychologically handle that transformation, day after day. Because we're just getting started. Chapter 6. House Call from Hell. Your first stop of the day is a house call. The city has given you a list, sometimes written, sometimes just verbal because paper is getting scarce, of places where people have reported symptoms. This particular house used to belong to a cloth merchant. Nice place, 2 stories, decent neighborhood. Used to be, anyway. You knock on the door with your long wooden stick, your plague staff. No direct contact, remember? Everything gets done at arm's length when possible. The door opens, and a woman looks out. She's maybe 30, but she looks 50. Her hair is stringy and unwashed. Her face is pale with dark circles under her eyes. And when she sees you, she starts crying. Not because she's happy to see help arriving, because she knows what you represent. You represent the end. Please, she says, and her voice is hoarse from crying, from screaming, from praying to any god who might be listening. Please, it's my children. You step inside, and immediately the smell hits you, even through the herbs in your beak. This isn't just the normal medieval smell of people living without modern sanitation. This is the smell of sickness, of bodies breaking down, of death that hasn't quite arrived yet. The house is dark because the windows have been shuttered. Medieval people thought sunlight and fresh air made plague worse, so plague houses were sealed up tight, which just made everything worse. The air is stale, hot, humid with breath and sweat and fear. She leads you upstairs to a small room where 2 children lie in a bed that's too big for them. A boy, maybe 8 years old, a girl, maybe 5. The boy is conscious but feverish. When he sees you, he tries to hide under the blanket because your costume terrifies him. Can you blame him? You look like a monster. The girl is worse. She's unconscious, burning with fever, and on her neck, just below her ear, is a swelling the size of a chicken egg. Dark, hard, painful looking, even though she's too far gone to feel it. A bubo, the signature of bubonic plague. Medical reality? Check. Now, here's what you know as a medieval doctor, which is basically nothing useful. You think plague is caused by bad air, evil spirits, or God's wrath for humanity's sins. You think the cure might involve bloodletting, prayer, or balancing the body's humors with various herbs and potions. You have no idea that plague is caused by bacteria. You've never heard of Yersinia pestis. You don't know about fleas or rats or the complex ecosystem of disease transmission that's killing everyone around you. All you know is that some people get better and most people die, and you have no earthly idea why. So what do? You take notes. You document symptoms, you record what the family has tried as treatment, you make your best guess about how long the children have been sick. You examine the children as best you can from a safe distance. You look for the telltale signs: fever, swelling, dark spots on the skin, difficulty breathing. And then you give the family the only honest answer you can: I don't know. You don't know if the children will live or die. You don't know what caused this. You don't know how to cure it. You don't even know if there is a cure. What you do know is that you need to move on to the next house because there are dozens more families waiting and they're all asking you the same impossible questions. Emotional beat. The mother grabs your sleeve as you turn to leave. Through your mask, muffled by the beak and the herbs and the leather, you hear yourself saying something comforting. Something about God's will, or doing everything possible, or keeping hope alive. But what you're really thinking is, these children are going to die, probably within the next day or two, and there's absolutely nothing I can do about it. Welcome to medieval medicine. Welcome to being a plague doctor. Chapter 7, The Streets of the Damned. Between house calls, you have to navigate the streets. And medieval streets during a plague aren't exactly a pleasant stroll through the neighborhood. First, there are the bodies. We talked about this before, but I don't think you really understand the scale. We're not talking about the occasional corpse that the authorities haven't gotten to yet. We're talking about bodies everywhere. In doorways, where people crawled out to die because their families were afraid to keep them inside. In the streets, where people collapsed while trying to get help and no one was brave enough to move them. In carts that were supposed to carry them to mass graves, but never made it that far. And here's something that's going to stick with you. You have to examine some of these bodies. Part of your job as a plague doctor is to confirm that people actually died of plague and not something else. Because even in the middle of an apocalypse, bureaucracy continues. The city needs to know if someone died of plague or murder or accident or just regular disease. So you have to get close to corpses that have been sitting in the summer heat for who knows how long. You kneel down next to a body. Let's say it's a man, middle-aged, lying face down in the mud and filth of a medieval street. You use your plague staff to turn him over, trying not to breathe too deeply, even though you know your beak is supposed to protect you. His face is swollen and discolored. His clothes are soaked with sweat, blood, and other fluids. There are dark patches on his visible skin that look like bruises but aren't bruises. You look for buboes, the swollen lymph nodes that are the signature of bubonic plague: neck, armpits, groin. You find them, swollen to the size of apples, hard as rocks. Plague, definitely plague. You make a note on your wax tablet or piece of parchment if you have one. You move on to the next body. Sensory overload description. But here's what's really messing with your head: the sounds. Medieval cities were never quiet, but plague cities have their own particular soundtrack. There's the constant low murmur of people praying. Not the peaceful, hopeful prayer you might hear in normal times, but desperate, begging prayer. The kind of prayer that comes from people who have nothing left but the hope that maybe God is still listening. There's crying, but not normal crying. This is the sound of people who have cried so much that they don't have regular tears left. It's dry, raspy, exhausted sobbing. There's coughing. Oh God, the coughing. Some people have pneumonic plague, the version that attacks the lungs, and they cough constantly, bringing up blood and God knows what else. And then there are the sounds that aren't quite human anymore. The death rattles, the delirium, the people who are so far gone with fever that they're talking to people who aren't there or screaming about things that aren't happening. All of this filters through your mask, muffled and distorted, like you're hearing it from underwater. I want you to stop for a second and really imagine this. Not just think about it intellectually, but really put yourself there. You're walking through streets filled with corpses, wearing a heavy leather costume in summer heat, breathing through a beak filled with herbs, and everywhere you look, people are dying in ways that are both horrible and completely mysterious to you. How long do you think you could handle this? A day? A week? A month? Because some plague doctors did this for months. Some of them survived the entire epidemic and went on to work through multiple outbreaks. Let me know in the comments if you think you have what it takes. But be honest, because we're not even at the worst part yet. Chapter 8. The Plague House. Your next stop is what they call a plague house. A house where so many people are sick or dead that it's basically been written off by the community. These houses are marked, sometimes with a red cross painted on the door, sometimes with a bundle of herbs or flowers that have long since died, sometimes just with the smell, which is so strong that people cross to the other side of the street to avoid it. This particular house used to belong to a large family, 3 generations living together, which was common in medieval times. Grandparents, parents, children, maybe a cousin or two. Let's say 12 people total. You know from your notes that symptoms first appeared here about a week ago. The city council sent you to check on the situation because no one has seen anyone come or go for 3 days. You knock on the door with your staff. No answer. You try the door. It's not locked because locks were expensive and most people didn't have them. The door swings open with a creak that sounds like something out of a horror movie. The smell that hits you is unlike anything you've ever experienced, and remember, you're already getting used to the smell of death. This is concentrated death. This is death that's been sitting and cooking in a closed house for days. You step inside, and immediately you understand why no one has come or gone. There's no one left alive to come or go. Graphic, but historically accurate description. Bodies are everywhere, in various stages of decomposition. Some are in beds, some are on the floor, some are slumped against walls where they collapsed and never got back up. The grandmother is in a chair by the cold fireplace, still wearing her best dress because she was probably trying to look nice for her final prayers. Her eyes are open but clouded over, and there's dried blood around her mouth. The father is face down near the door, like he was trying to leave, maybe to get help, maybe just to escape. The dark patches of plague are visible on his neck and hands. 2 children are in a bed upstairs, holding each other. They probably died within hours of each other, because neither one would have had the strength to move much in their final moments. And here's the thing that's going to haunt you. You have to examine all of them. You have to confirm that they died of plague. You have to make notes about the progression of the disease. You have to look for anything unusual that might give you a clue about treatment or prevention. So you spend the next hour in this house of death, moving from body to body, taking notes, trying to learn something, anything, that might help the people who are still alive. Psychological horror element. But the worst part isn't the bodies themselves. The worst part is the evidence of how they lived in their final days. There are bowls of water that have long since evaporated, placed next to beds where people were trying to cool fever-burning skin. There are pieces of bread, hard as rocks now, that someone put aside for family members who were too sick to eat but might want food later. There are letters, scratched out on pieces of wood or parchment, that people wrote to family members in other cities. Letters they never got to send because they died before anyone could carry them. There are children's toys, carefully arranged next to small bodies because someone wanted to make sure the kids had their favorite things with them when they died. This isn't just death. This is the death of hope, the death of families, the death of normal human life. And you're documenting it all, one body at a time. Now, I want you to really think about what this would do to your psyche. You're not just seeing death. You're seeing the intimate details of how families fell apart, how people spent their final moments, how love and fear and desperation played out in real time. And you have to do this professionally. You have to stay calm, take notes, make rational observations. You can't break down crying, even though every human instinct is telling you to run away screaming. Well, you have to be the plague doctor. Because if you're not, then who will be? Chapter 9, The Living Dead. Your next house call is somehow worse than the plague house, because this time people are still alive. Barely. This is a smaller house, maybe just one family. When you knock, a voice from inside calls out, but it's so weak you can barely hear it. You let yourself in. A man, probably in his 40s but looking ancient, is sitting on the floor next to a bed. On the bed is a woman, his wife, you assume, and she's unconscious but still breathing. The man looks up at you, and his eyes are the most heartbreaking thing you've seen yet. Not because he's crying, but because he's gone beyond crying. He's reached that place where there are no tears left, no hope left, no fight left. She's been like this for 2 days, he whispers, and his voice is hoarse from talking to someone who can't hear him. I keep talking to her, but she doesn't answer anymore. You examine the woman as best you can. Fever, obviously. Her skin is burning hot, even through her clothes. Buboes on her neck and under her arms, swollen and dark. Her breathing is shallow and irregular. She's dying. She might have hours, might have a day or two at most. The man knows this. You know this. But you're both pretending there might be hope. Is there anything? He starts, then stops. Can you do anything? And here's the nightmare of being a plague doctor. You have to answer this question dozens of times a day, and the answer is always the same. No, there's nothing you can do. No medicine that works, no treatment that helps, no procedure that saves lives. You're basically a record keeper, documenting the end of the world one family at a time. But you can't say that. You can't tell this man that his wife is definitely going to die and there's nothing anyone can do about it, because then what's the point of your existence? So instead, you lie. Keep her comfortable, you tell him through your beak mask, your voice distorted and echoing. Make sure she has water if she can drink it. Pray for her. Stay with her. It's not medical advice. It's not treatment. It's just human advice, the only kind that matters when medicine has failed completely. The man nods and turns back to his wife. He takes her hand, her burning, fever-hot hand, and starts talking to her again. Quietly, gently, telling her about their children who died last week, about the garden they planted together this spring, about plans they made for the future that will never happen. You leave them alone with their love and their grief, emotional weight. Outside the house, you stop for a moment, just a moment, because you don't have time for more than that. You're starting to understand something that's going to follow you for the rest of your life, however long that might be. You're not really a doctor anymore. You're a witness. You're witnessing the end of families, the end of communities, the end of a way of life that's existed for centuries. And there's nothing you can do except watch and document and try to maintain some small shred of human dignity in the middle of complete chaos. This is what it means to be a plague doctor. This is the nightmare behind the beak. Chapter 10, the mass grave. By afternoon, you're exhausted. The leather costume is soaked with sweat. The herbs in your beak have turned into a soggy mess that's harder to breathe through. And you've seen more death in one day than most people see in a lifetime. But your job isn't done. Your final stop of the day is the mass grave. Medieval cities had elaborate burial traditions, proper funerals, individual graves, ceremonies that honored the dead and comforted the living. All of that went out the window when people started dying faster than they could be buried properly. The mass grave is located outside the city walls because even medieval people understood that you don't want to bury plague victims where the living have to smell them. It's a pit, a big pit, dug by whoever was still healthy enough to hold a shovel, maybe 50 feet long, 20 feet wide, 10 feet deep, and it's filling up fast. Bodies are brought here in carts, wheelbarrows, sometimes just dragged on pieces of cloth or leather. There's no ceremony, no individual graves, no headstones, just bodies in a pit. Your job is to examine any bodies that look suspicious. Anything that might not be plague, anything that might be murder or accident or some other kind of death that requires different handling. So you climb down into the pit. Visceral description. I want you to really picture this. You're climbing down into a pit filled with corpses, wearing a heavy leather costume in summer heat, breathing through a beak that's making you dizzy. The ground under your feet isn't ground anymore. It's soft, squishy, uneven. You're walking on bodies. The smell is beyond description. It's not just death, it's concentrated death, accelerated by heat and humidity and the sheer number of bodies all in one place. Flies are everywhere. Not just a few flies, but clouds of them so thick that they form a buzzing black curtain around your head. They get into your eyepieces, they land on your gloves, they try to get into your mask. And you have to work in this environment. You have to kneel down next to bodies, examine them, make rational decisions about cause of death. Some of the bodies are fresh, people who died within the last day or two. Others have been here longer and they're not fresh anymore. You find what you're looking for, a man whose injuries don't look like plague. There are wounds on his head and chest that look like they came from violence, not disease. Someone was probably murdered and thrown in with the plague victims to hide the crime. You make notes. Even in the middle of an apocalypse, murder is still murder, and someone might want to know about it later. If there is a later, you examine a few more bodies, confirm that most of them died of plague, and finally climb out of the pit. Psychological breaking point. As you're climbing out, something happens that breaks your brain just a little bit. A small hand grabs your ankle. You look down, and there's a child, maybe 7 or 8 years old, who apparently isn't quite dead yet. He was thrown into the pit with the corpses, but somehow he's still breathing. His eyes are open, looking up at you through your terrifying mask, and his mouth is moving like he's trying to say something. For just a moment, your professional detachment cracks completely. You're not the plague doctor anymore. You're just a human being who found a dying child in a pit full of corpses. You want to help? Every instinct in your body is screaming at you to pull this child out of the pit, to try to save him, to do something other than leave him there to die. But you can't. You can't because he's obviously dying. The buboes on his neck are huge and dark and he's burning with fever. You can't because you don't have any treatment that would help. You can't because if you take him out of the pit, where would you take him? Who would care for him? And you can't because you might catch plague from direct contact, and if you die, then who's going to examine all the other bodies tomorrow? So you do the only thing you can do. You climb out of the pit and leave the child there. But first, you kneel down and say a prayer. Through your beak mask, in a voice that doesn't sound like your own anymore, you whisper whatever words of comfort you can remember. Maybe the Lord's Prayer. Maybe just, I'm sorry. The child's eyes follow your movement as you stand up and walk away. And that image, those eyes, looking up at you from a pit of death, that's going to be with you forever. This is the moment when you understand that being a plague doctor isn't just about examining the sick and documenting the dead. It's about making impossible choices over and over again until you're not sure if you're saving people or just managing the apocalypse. Chapter 11, The Science of Superstition. Now let's take a step back and talk about why the plague doctor costume existed in the first place. Because the more you understand about medieval medicine, the more you realize that these people were fighting a war they couldn't possibly win. Remember, this is the 14th century. People still think the Earth is the center of the universe. They think illness is caused by an imbalance of bodily fluids, or by bad air, or by God's wrath for humanity's sins. The idea that tiny, invisible creatures could cause disease, that's literally centuries in the future. So when people started dying in unprecedented numbers, the medical establishment did what they always did. They fell back on the theories they had, no matter how wrong those theories turned out to be. Miasma theory. Explanation. The big theory was miasma, the idea that disease was caused by bad air. If you could smell something foul, that meant the air itself was corrupted and dangerous. Now, this wasn't completely crazy. Plague cities did smell terrible, and areas with lots of rotting corpses were definitely more dangerous than areas without them. The medieval doctors were right, that there was a connection between bad smells and disease. They were just wrong about everything else. They thought the smell itself was the problem. They didn't understand that the smell was just a byproduct of the real problem. Rats, fleas, bacteria, and an ecosystem of disease transmission that was completely invisible to them. So their solution was to create better air. That's where the beak comes in. The plague doctor's beak was essentially a medieval air filter. It was stuffed with aromatic herbs and spices that were supposed to purify the air before it reached your lungs. Lavender, rosemary, thyme, cloves, cinnamon, juniper berries, anything that smelled strong and pleasant. The theory was that if you could overwhelm the bad smells with good smells, you could prevent the bad air from making you sick. Reality, check. Here's the thing that's going to blow your mind. It actually worked. Not for the reasons they thought it worked, but it did provide some protection. The thick leather costume created a barrier between the doctor and infected fleas. The beak, while useless for filtering air, did keep the doctor from touching their face with contaminated hands. The long staff maintained distance between the doctor and infected patients. Medieval plague doctors were accidentally inventing hazmat suits and social distancing hundreds of years before anyone understood why these things might be helpful. They were doing the right thing for completely wrong reasons. But here's the nightmare part. Even when they did everything right, most of them still died. Because no matter how good your protective equipment is, if you're working in close contact with plague victims for months at a time, eventually your luck runs out. Eventually you make a mistake, or your equipment fails, or you just get exposed to too much contamination for your defenses to handle. Survival statistics. We don't have exact numbers because record keeping during the plague was, well, it was a little chaotic. But estimates suggest that somewhere between 40% and 60% of plague doctors died during the epidemics they served. Think about that for a minute. You're signing up for a job where there's a better than even chance that you're going to die. And you're doing it while wearing a costume that makes you look like the angel of death, treating patients you can't help. With medicine that doesn't work, why would anyone do this? Money, partly. Plague doctors were paid well, assuming there was anyone left alive to pay them, and assuming money still meant anything in a collapsed economy. Duty, partly. If you were one of the few people with medical training, there was enormous pressure to help, even if your help wasn't very helpful. But mostly, I think, it was because someone had to do it. Someone had to be the witness. Someone had to examine the bodies, comfort the families, document the catastrophe. Someone had to maintain the pretense that human society still existed, even when it was falling apart. And if that someone happened to look like a supernatural creature of death, well, maybe that was appropriate. Chapter 12, The Psychology of the Mask. Let's talk about what it was really like to be inside that mask, because the physical discomfort, the heat, the weight, the difficulty breathing, that was just the beginning. The psychological effect of wearing the plague doctor costume was something no one anticipated, and it changed the people who wore it in ways that lasted long after the plague was over. Identity, dissolution. First, there's the complete loss of personal identity. When you put on that mask, you stop being yourself. You can't see your own face, people can't see your expressions. Your voice is distorted beyond recognition. You become a symbol instead of a person. You become the thing that represents death, fear, and the end of hope. And here's what's really messing with your head. After a while, you start to feel like that symbol. You start to think of yourself as something other than human. It's a psychological defense mechanism, actually. If you're human, then the things you're seeing, the mass death, the suffering families, the children in plague pits, those things will destroy you emotionally. But if you're not human anymore, if you're just the plague doctor, then you can function. You can do your job. You can walk through hell and come out the other side. The mask doesn't just protect your body from disease. It protects your mind from reality. Sensory deprivation. Then there's the sensory isolation. Inside that mask, your world becomes very small and very strange. Your vision is limited to what you can see through two small glass or crystal windows. No peripheral vision, no ability to look up or down without moving your entire head. Your hearing is muffled by leather and distorted by the shape of the beak. Conversations sound like they're happening underwater. Your sense of smell is completely overwhelmed by herbs. After a few hours, you can't smell anything else. Not the plague houses, not the corpses, not even your own body odor. Touch is limited to what you can feel through thick leather gloves. You can't feel texture, temperature, or fine details. Everything becomes crude and clumsy. And taste? Well, all you taste is herbs and your own recycled breath, hour after hour after hour. It's like being trapped inside your own head, cut off from normal human sensory experience. Dehumanization. Effect. But here's the most disturbing part. Other people stop seeing you as human too. When families see you approaching their house, they don't see Dr. Giovanni or Dr. Smith coming to help. They see death itself walking up to their door. Children scream when they see you. Adults cross themselves and mutter prayers. Some people won't let you in their houses because they think you're not a doctor at all. You're some kind of supernatural creature that feeds on human suffering. And after a while, you start to understand their reaction. Because when you catch a glimpse of yourself in a reflection, in water or polished metal or glass, you don't recognize the thing looking back at you either. You've become a monster. Not metaphorically, but literally, in the eyes of everyone around you. Psychological survival mechanism. The weird thing is, this dehumanization actually helps you do your job. When you're just a symbol, you don't have to carry the emotional weight of individual tragedies. When people see you as death personified, they don't expect human comfort or normal social interaction. You can examine corpses without breaking down crying because you're not really there as a person. You can tell families that their loved ones are going to die because the news isn't coming from a human being. It's coming from an inevitable force of nature. The mask gives you permission to be detached, clinical professional in situations where normal human emotion would be completely overwhelming. But it comes at a cost, because when you finally take the mask off at the end of the day, you have to somehow remember how to be human again. You have to reconnect with your own emotions, your own identity, your own humanity. And some people never quite manage it. Long-term psychological damage. The plague doctors who survived the epidemics, they were never quite the same afterward. Some of them couldn't practice medicine anymore. They'd seen too much death, made too many impossible choices, watched too many people die despite their best efforts. Some of them became obsessed with death and disease. They spent the rest of their lives studying plague, trying to understand what they'd witnessed, trying to find meaning in the nightmare they'd lived through. And some of them just disappeared. They took off the mask one day and walked away from their old lives completely. New names, new cities, new identities, anything to escape the memory of what they'd been. The plague doctor costume was supposed to protect the body from disease. What no one realized is that it also created a kind of psychological disease of its own, a disconnection from humanity that was sometimes just as deadly as the plague itself. Chapter 13, The Night Shift. Your workday doesn't end when the sun goes down. If anything, night shifts are worse because darkness makes everything more terrifying. Medieval cities weren't exactly well lit under normal circumstances, but during a plague, most of the streetlights, such as they were, have gone out. The people who maintained them are dead. The oil or candles that fueled them are running out. So you're walking through dark streets, wearing a costume that makes you look like a supernatural creature, carrying a lantern that casts dancing shadows on everything around you. The families who call for help at night are usually the ones who have given up hope during the day. They've watched their loved ones get worse and worse, and finally, in desperation, they send someone to find the plague doctor. "Please come," they say. "Please, I think she's dying." And you know, even before you get there, that they're right. Midnight house call. This particular call comes from a house you've been to before. A young couple with a new baby. The husband had symptoms when you saw them 3 days ago, but he was still conscious, still able to talk. Now, when you arrive, the wife meets you at the door and she's holding the baby. Both of them are crying. Inside, the husband is unconscious on the bed. His breathing is shallow and irregular, the death rattle that you've learned to recognize. The buboes on his neck have turned black, which means his tissue is dying. He's not going to see morning. The wife knows this. You know this. But she called you anyway, because what else could she do? "Can you?" She starts, then stops. "Is there anything?" And once again, you have to give the answer that never gets easier. No. But this time, there's a complication. This time, there's the baby. The baby is maybe 6 months old and it's showing symptoms. Fever, obvious from the way it's crying, and the heat radiating from its small body. A small swelling on its neck that might be a bubo, or might just be a swollen lymph node from regular infant illness. You can't tell the difference. Medieval medicine doesn't have the tools to distinguish between plague and normal childhood illness in a baby this young. So you're faced with an impossible choice. Do you recommend that the mother separate herself from the baby just in case it has plague? Do you tell her to keep the baby close because it might just be sick and need comfort? Do you advise her to flee the city with the baby and hope for the best? Oh, moral complexity. Here's what makes this situation a nightmare. There's no right answer. If the baby has plague and the mother stays close, she'll probably get infected and die, leaving the baby orphaned. If the baby doesn't have plague and the mother abandons it, the baby will definitely die alone. If they flee the city, they might escape infection, or they might just carry plague to whatever community they end up in. Every choice leads to death. The only question is who dies and how. You look at this young mother holding her potentially dying baby, sitting next to her definitely dying husband, and you realize that your job isn't really about medicine anymore. It's about helping people make impossible choices in impossible circumstances. What would you do? She asks you. If it was your family, what would you do? And the honest answer is, I have no idea. Because the truth is, no one is equipped for this. No one has ever faced a catastrophe this complete, this overwhelming. There are no guidebooks, no precedents, no experts who really know what they're talking about. Everyone is just making it up as they go along, hoping that somehow they'll guess right, knowing that most of the time they'll guess wrong. The weight of authority. But here's the cruel irony. Because you're wearing the plague doctor costume, people expect you to have answers. The mask, the beak, the formal medical training, it all gives you an authority that you haven't earned and don't deserve. This woman is asking you to make a life or death decision about her baby based on medical knowledge that doesn't exist. She's treating you like an expert on a disease that no one understands. And you have to give her an answer, because if you don't, she'll make a decision on her own. And at least this way she can tell herself that she followed medical advice. So you say something. Maybe you recommend that she keep the baby close because separation might be worse than the risk of infection. Maybe you recommend that she try to find a wet nurse or relative to care for the baby while she tends to her husband. It doesn't matter what you recommend, because you're just guessing. But it matters to her, because your recommendation gives her permission to do what she was probably going to do anyway. That's really what the plague doctor has become. Not a healer, but a person who gives official permission for people to make terrible choices in terrible circumstances. Chapter 14. The Breaking Point. 3 months into the plague, something happens that changes everything for you personally. You wake up one morning, and instead of checking yourself for symptoms like you always do, you realize you don't care anymore. Not because you think you're immune. You've seen too many people die to believe that anyone is truly safe. But because the idea of dying has stopped being frightening. In fact, it's started to seem peaceful. You've seen so much death that it's become normal. You've made so many impossible choices that your moral compass has completely shattered. You've been the angel of death for so long that you've forgotten how to be anything else. This is what we would call burnout today, but medieval people didn't have a word for it. All they knew was that sometimes people who worked with plague victims would just stop caring, stop trying, stop functioning as human beings. Mental health crisis. The signs have been building for weeks. You've stopped eating regularly because food doesn't taste like anything anymore through the herb-saturated air of your mask. You've stopped sleeping well because every time you close your eyes, you see the faces of people you couldn't save. You've stopped talking to other people unless it's absolutely necessary for your job, because normal human conversation feels fake and meaningless after spending your days discussing death. And you've started taking risks that you wouldn't have taken early in the epidemic, getting closer to infected patients than necessary, not changing your herb stuffing as often as you should, walking through areas of the city that you know are particularly dangerous. It's not exactly suicidal behavior, but it's not exactly careful either. It's like you're testing fate, seeing how much exposure you can handle before something gives the last straw. The breaking point comes when you're called to examine a family where everyone is dead except one person. A girl, maybe 12 years old, who somehow survived while her parents, siblings, and grandparents all died around her. She's not infected. She's not even sick. She's just alone. Completely, utterly alone. She's been living in this house with the corpses of her family for who knows how long because she doesn't know what else to do. There's nowhere for her to go. No relatives left alive to take her in. No social services that still function. When you find her, she's sitting in a corner staring at nothing, rocking back and forth slightly. She doesn't react when you come in. She doesn't seem to see you even though her eyes are open. She's broken. Not physically. There's nothing medically wrong with her, but psychologically she's just gone. And you realize that you're looking at your own future. This is what happens to the people who survive. This is what's waiting for you if you make it through the plague. Not relief, not celebration, not a return to normal life. Just emptiness. Existential crisis. You sit down in that house of corpses, next to this broken child, and for the first time in months you take off your mask. You pull off the beak, unlace the straps, and let the thing fall to the floor. The air in the house is foul beyond description, but somehow it smells better than the herbs you've been breathing for months. It smells real. You look at your hands, your actual hands, not hands covered in thick leather gloves, and they look strange to you, pale, thin, scarred from months of wearing the costume. They don't look like your hands anymore. You touch your face and realize that you can barely remember what it feels like to have skin contact with the world. Everything has been filtered through leather and glass and herbs for so long that direct sensation feels almost overwhelming. For just a moment, you remember what it was like to be human, and then you remember why you stopped. The choice. Because here's the thing. Once you've seen what you've seen, once you've lived through what you've lived through, you can't go back to pretending that normal life matters. You can't get excited about trivial problems. You can't worry about money or status or social relationships when you've spent months walking through mass graves. You can't find meaning in anything that isn't life or death, because you've lived in a world where everything is life or death. So you have a choice to make. You can take off the costume and try to rebuild some kind of normal life, knowing that you'll never quite fit into normal society again. Or you can put the mask back on and keep being the plague doctor, because at least that role makes sense in the nightmare world you're living in. You look at the broken girl sitting in her corner staring at nothing. You pick up the mask, you put it back on, because someone has to be the plague doctor. And if it's not you, then who? Chapter 15, The Science Behind the Horror. Now let's take a break from the nightmare and talk about what was actually happening from a medical perspective, because the more you understand about plague itself, the real scientific cause of all this horror, the more you realize how helpless medieval doctors really were. Bacterial reality. Yersinia pestis. That's the villain of our story. A bacterium so small that medieval people couldn't even imagine its existence, but so deadly that it killed an estimated 75 to 200 million people during the 14th century alone. Here's how it actually worked. Fleas living on rats would bite infected rats and pick up the bacteria. The bacteria would multiply in the flea's stomach until it literally blocked the flea's digestive system. The flea, now essentially starving because it can't digest food, becomes desperately hungry and starts biting everything it can find. When the flea bites a human, it tries to feed but can't swallow properly because of the bacterial blockage. So it vomits infected blood directly into the bite wound. Congratulations, you now have plague. The bacteria spread through your lymphatic system, which is why the lymph nodes, what medieval people called buboes, swell up like apples. Your body is trying to fight the infection, but it's losing. If you're unlucky, the bacteria get into your lungs. Now you have pneumonic plague and you're coughing up infectious droplets that can spread the disease directly from person to person. If you're really unlucky, the bacteria get into your bloodstream. Now you have septicemic plague and you're basically dead. The bacteria are producing toxins that shut down your organs one by one. Medieval misconceptions. Medieval doctors saw the symptoms, but had no idea what was causing them. So they came up with theories that made sense based on what they knew about the world. Bad air? Well, plague cities did smell terrible, and the disease seemed to spread in areas with bad smells. Logical connection, wrong cause, God's wrath. People were dying in unprecedented numbers, often the same people who had lived sinful lives. Divine punishment seemed like a reasonable explanation. Astrological influences? The planets were in unusual alignments around the time the plague started. Obviously, the stars were affecting human health. Imbalanced humors? Plague victims had fever, too much hot, dry humor, and swelling, too much wet humor. Clearly, their bodily fluids were out of whack. All of these theories made perfect sense based on medieval understanding of how the world worked. They were all completely wrong, but they weren't stupid. Why the costume worked? Sort of. Remember, the plague doctor costume accidentally provided some real protection, even though the people wearing it had no idea why. The leather barrier made it harder for fleas to reach the doctor's skin. Not impossible. Fleas are persistent little bastards, but harder. The beak kept the doctor from touching their face with contaminated hands. This was actually hugely important because people constantly touch their faces without thinking about it. The long staff maintained distance from patients, reducing the chance of direct contact with infectious droplets if the patient had pneumonic plague. The thick gloves prevented cuts and scrapes that could have provided easy entry points for bacteria. But here's the thing. None of this protection was foolproof. Medieval people didn't understand decontamination, so they often reused equipment without properly cleaning it. They didn't understand vector control, so they did nothing about the rats and fleas that were actually spreading the disease. And most importantly, they were working in extremely high exposure environments for extended periods of time. Even modern hazmat suits aren't designed for months of continuous use in active plague zones. The numbers game. Let's talk about the actual mortality rates, because they're more terrifying than any horror movie. Bubonic plague, the standard version where the bacteria attack your lymph nodes, killed about 60% of the people who got infected. That means if you caught it, you had a 40% chance of survival. Pneumonic plague, the lung version, killed about 90% of infected people. If you started coughing up blood, you were almost certainly dead. Septicemic plague, the blood poisoning version, killed essentially 100% of people who developed it. There are no recorded cases of anyone surviving septicemic plague without modern antibiotics. Now, here's the really fun part. Plague doctors were constantly exposed to all three forms simultaneously. The patients they examined had bubonic plague. The air in plague houses contained pneumonic plague droplets. And if they accidentally cut themselves on contaminated equipment, they risked septicemic plague. Every single day, they were rolling the dice with death. Not once, not twice, but dozens of times. And the dice were loaded against them. Medieval treatment attempts. The treatments that medieval doctors tried were, well, let's just say they didn't help. Bloodletting. Because plague victims had fever, doctors thought they had too much hot blood. So they cut open veins to let the excess blood drain out. This actually made patients weaker and more likely to die. Lancing buboes. Doctors would cut open the swollen lymph nodes to drain the evil humors. This sometimes provided temporary pain relief, but it also created open wounds that could get infected with other diseases. Herbal remedies. Patients were given mixtures of herbs that were supposed to restore their humoral balance. Some of these herbs actually had mild medicinal properties, but nothing that could fight bacterial infection. Prayer and religious rituals. When medicine failed, people turned to spiritual remedies. This provided psychological comfort, but didn't affect the disease itself. The most effective treatment was actually isolation, keeping infected people away from healthy ones. But medieval people implemented this inconsistently, and they didn't understand why it worked. The real tragedy. Here's what makes the plague doctor story so tragic. These people were trying to fight a bacterial infection with 14th century technology. It's like trying to perform brain surgery with a butter knife. Not because you're stupid, but because butter knives are the most advanced medical tools available to you. Plague doctors were intelligent, dedicated people who genuinely wanted to help. They risked their lives every day. They documented everything they could. They tried every treatment they could think of. And almost none of it mattered, because the real enemy was invisible to them. They were fighting a war they couldn't see, against an enemy they couldn't understand with weapons that didn't work, but they kept fighting anyway, because someone had to. Chapter 16. The social breakdown. Let's talk about what the plague did to society itself. Because individual death, horrible as it was just the beginning. The real nightmare was watching human civilization collapse in real time. Economic collapse. Imagine your local economy, but 1/3 of all the workers are dead. The baker, dead. The blacksmith, dead. The people who grew food, transported goods, maintained roads, collected taxes, most of them, dead. In a pre-industrial economy, everything depends on human labor. There are no machines to pick up the slack when people die. When the workers disappear, the work simply doesn't get done. Fields went unharvested because there weren't enough farmers left alive to bring in the crops. Roads fell into disrepair because there weren't enough people to maintain them. Markets closed because there weren't enough merchants to run them. Money became almost meaningless in some areas because you can't eat gold coins, and there was nothing to buy, even if you had money. Some people became incredibly wealthy overnight, inheriting property from multiple dead relatives, while others starved because their entire livelihood had disappeared. Breakdown of law and order. When that many people die that quickly, all the social structures that hold civilization together start to crumble. Local governments fell apart because the officials were dead. Courts stopped functioning because the judges and lawyers were dead. Law enforcement disappeared because the guards and constables were dead. In some cities, complete lawlessness took over. People looted empty houses, stole from the dead, committed crimes that would have been unthinkable in normal times. But here's the weird part. In other cities, people became extremely religious and law-abiding because they thought the plague was divine punishment for humanity's sins. Some communities turned to vigilante justice, executing people for minor crimes, because they believed strict moral enforcement might convince God to end the plague. Others turned to hedonism, figuring that if they were all going to die anyway, they might as well enjoy their final days. There was no consistent social response because there was no precedent for this level of catastrophe. Religious crisis. The plague destroyed medieval religious faith in ways that took centuries to recover from. People had been taught that God was just, that prayer was effective, that the church could provide protection and comfort in times of trouble. Then the plague hit, and none of that turned out to be true. Good people died just as fast as evil people. Priests died just as fast as sinners. Children died just as fast as adults. Prayer didn't help. Religious ceremonies didn't help. Being a faithful Christian didn't help. Some people responded by becoming more religious, figuring that they needed to pray harder and be more faithful to earn God's protection. Others became less religious, concluding that either God didn't exist, or he didn't care about human suffering, or he was actively malevolent. And some people went completely insane with religious fervor, joining groups of flagellants who wandered from town to town whipping themselves bloody, thinking that they could take on the sins of humanity and convince God to end the plague. The scapegoating. When people are terrified and desperate, they look for someone to blame. And medieval Europe had a convenient scapegoat, Jewish communities. Anti-Semitic conspiracy theories spread almost as fast as the plague itself. Jews were accused of poisoning wells, practicing dark magic, conspiring with Satan to destroy Christian society. Never mind that Jewish communities were dying from plague at the same rate as everyone else. Never mind that the accusations made no logical sense. Fear doesn't care about logic. Entire Jewish communities were massacred by Christian mobs who convinced themselves that killing Jews would end the plague. Thousands of innocent people were murdered based on completely fabricated conspiracy theories. The plague didn't just kill people directly, it killed the social bonds that hold communities together, turning neighbors against neighbors, friends against friends. Generational trauma. The people who survived the plague were permanently changed by what they'd experienced. Children who grew up during the plague years had a completely different relationship with death, suffering, and social stability than previous generations. They'd seen their parents die, their communities collapse, their entire world disappear. They learned not to trust that life would continue, not to count on social institutions, not to believe that tomorrow would be like today. This created a generation that was simultaneously more fatalistic and more hedonistic than their ancestors. They were more likely to take risks, more likely to live for the moment, less likely to plan for the future. The economic disruption lasted for decades. The social disruption lasted for centuries. The psychological disruption arguably never fully healed. The plague doctor as symbol. And in the middle of all this social collapse, there was the plague doctor. To most people, the plague doctor represented the last vestige of civilization trying to function in the middle of chaos. They were a symbol that someone, somewhere, was still trying to maintain order and provide help. But they were also a symbol of how inadequate civilization was in the face of real catastrophe. They represented the failure of human knowledge, the powerlessness of authority, the inability of social institutions to protect people when it really mattered. The plague doctor costume became a visual representation of society's attempt to fight the apocalypse, and the fact that the costume was so alien, so frightening, so inhuman, that said something about what society had to become in order to survive. When normal human institutions fail, when normal human responses are inadequate, you have to become something else, something that isn't quite human anymore. Chapter 17, The Long Night Continues. 6 months into the plague, you've stopped counting the dead. Not because there aren't enough dead to count, but because the numbers have become meaningless. When you're dealing with mass death on this scale, individual deaths stop registering as tragedies and start registering as statistics. You've developed a kind of professional numbness that would have horrified you 6 months ago, but now seems like the only way to stay sane. You examine bodies, you document symptoms, you comfort families, you make recommendations that you know won't help, and you go home every night to a city that looks less and less like a place where human beings live, the new normal. Because here's what's really disturbing. After a while, this becomes normal. You stop being shocked by corpses in the street. You stop being surprised when families you've been treating simply disappear. You stop expecting social institutions to function. You develop routines for navigating a post-apocalyptic landscape, and these routines start to feel as natural as your old routines used to feel. Check yourself for symptoms. Normal. Put on the costume. Normal. Walk through streets lined with bodies. Normal. Examine plague victims. Normal. Come home to an empty, silent city. Normal. The most horrifying thing about human psychology is how adaptable it is. You can get used to almost anything if you're exposed to it long enough, and you've gotten used to the end of the world. Professional evolution. Your job description has expanded far beyond anything recognizable as medicine. You're part doctor, part coroner, part social worker, part priest, part government official. You examine the living, catalog the dead, comfort the bereaved, enforce public health measures, and provide official authority in situations where all other authority has collapsed. You've become a one-person government, making decisions that affect entire families based on medical knowledge that you know is inadequate. Should this family flee the city? You don't know, but you have to give them an answer. Should this child be separated from its infected parent? You don't know, but you have to make a recommendation. Should this house be sealed up and abandoned? You don't know, but someone has to decide. You're not qualified to make any of these decisions, but you're the only official left with any kind of authority, so the decisions fall to you by default. The weight of symbols and the costume. The costume has taken on a life of its own. Children who see you don't see a doctor anymore. They see a supernatural force, something that exists outside normal human categories. Some of them think you're an angel sent by God to help the faithful. Others think you're a demon sent by Satan to harvest souls. Most just think you're death itself, walking among the living. Adults react to you with a mixture of hope and terror that's unlike anything in normal human interaction. You represent the possibility of medical help, but you also represent the confirmation that medical help isn't going to work. When people see you approaching their house, they know that their situation has become officially hopeless. You're not bringing medicine anymore. You're bringing official recognition that they're dying. Personal relationships. The few other plague doctors still alive have become your only real human contact because you're the only people who understand what this job actually involves. Normal people can't relate to what you've seen, what you've done, what you've become. They look at you with a mixture of gratitude and horror that makes normal friendship impossible. How do you explain to someone what it's like to spend your days walking through mass graves? How do you describe the sound a family makes when you tell them their child is going to die? How do you convey the weight of making life or death decisions based on knowledge that doesn't exist? You can't. So you stop trying. The other plague doctors become your family because they're the only people who speak your language anymore. When you meet them at the end of a shift, you don't have to explain why you look exhausted, why you're drinking heavily, why you can't sleep. They know. But even these relationships are strained because you're all competing for the same psychological resources. You're all trying to maintain the same fragile grip on sanity. And sometimes helping someone else means sacrificing your own mental health. The children of the plague. One of the worst parts of your job is dealing with the children who survive. Not the children who get plague and recover. Those are actually relatively easy to handle, medically speaking. They're sick, they get better or they don't. You document the results. The hard cases are the children who don't get sick but lose their entire families. Medieval society didn't have orphanages or foster care systems that could handle this kind of massive social disruption. When a child's parents, grandparents, siblings, aunts, uncles, and cousins all died within a few weeks, there was often literally no one left to care for them. These children would wander the streets, living in abandoned houses, eating whatever they could find, trying to survive in a world that had no place for them. Some of them formed small groups, bands of orphans who looked out for each other with the kind of desperate cooperation that only emerges in extreme circumstances. Others just gave up. Children as young as 5 or 6 would simply stop eating, stop moving, stop responding to the world around them. They would sit in corners and wait to die because death seemed easier than trying to figure out how to live. And part of your job was to decide what to do with them. Impossible decisions, because that's what your job had really become, making impossible decisions in impossible circumstances. You'd find a 7-year-old girl living alone in a house with the corpses of her parents, and you'd have to decide, do you try to find someone to take her in, knowing that most people are afraid that orphans might be carrying plague? Do you recommend that she be taken to the overcrowded, disease-ridden communal shelters that have been set up for orphans? Do you leave her where she is and hope she can survive on her own? There's no good answer. Every option leads to probable death. But you have to choose something, because not choosing is also a choice. So you make the best decision you can with inadequate information, knowing that you'll probably never find out whether you chose correctly, and knowing that you'll have to live with the consequences either way. This is what breaks plague doctors, ultimately. Not the physical horror, not the disease, not even the constant exposure to death. It's the weight of making decisions that you're not qualified to make over and over again, knowing that people's lives depend on choices that you're essentially guessing about. Chapter 18, the hierarchy of horror. Let's talk about something that's going to make you uncomfortable. After a while, you start to develop preferences about death. Not because you become cruel or callous, but because when you're exposed to every possible way that human beings can die, you start to understand that some deaths are worse than others. The death spectrum. Quick deaths from septicemic plague, where people go from healthy to dead in a matter of hours, start to seem merciful compared to the slow deaths from bubonic plague, where people suffer for days or weeks. Deaths of elderly people, who have already lived full lives, start to seem more acceptable than deaths of children, who never got a chance to experience anything. Deaths of people who are unconscious start to seem easier than deaths of people who remain aware and terrified until the very end. You develop a mental ranking system for tragedy, and you hate yourself for it, but you can't stop yourself from doing it because it's the only way your brain can process this much horror. Professional triage. And this hierarchy affects how you do your job. When you have limited time and resources, which is always, you start making unconscious decisions about which cases deserve more attention. A family with young children gets more of your time than a family with only elderly members. A patient who might possibly survive gets more attention than a patient who is obviously dying. A community leader gets priority over a beggar. You tell yourself that this is just practical medicine, that you're allocating your limited resources where they can do the most good. But deep down, you know that you're making moral judgments about whose life is worth saving, and you're making these judgments based on criteria that would have horrified you before the plague started. The mathematics of suffering. Because here's the thing that no one talks about. When death becomes this common, individual deaths stop feeling tragic. The first family you couldn't save haunted you for weeks. The 10th family barely registered. The 100th family was just another item on your daily checklist. It's not that you stopped caring, it's that your emotional capacity has limits, and you've exceeded those limits so completely that your feelings have just shut down. You care about death in the abstract, you care about ending the plague, you care about doing your job well, but you can't care about individual people anymore because caring about individuals would make it impossible to function. This is what we would now recognize as a psychological defense mechanism. But medieval people didn't have concepts for this kind of emotional self-protection. All you know is that you used to feel things more strongly, and now you don't, and you're not sure if that makes you a better plague doctor or a worse human being. The guilt of survival. And then there's the question that keeps you awake at night. Why haven't you died yet? You've been exposed to plague more than almost anyone in the city. You've handled infected bodies, breathed contaminated air, worked in conditions that killed most of the other doctors who started this job when you did. By all rights, you should be dead. So why aren't you? Are you just lucky? Are you somehow naturally immune? Did your protective equipment work better than you thought? Is God protecting you for some reason? Or, and this is the thought that really terrifies you, are you already infected but just haven't developed symptoms yet? Because some people take weeks to show signs of plague. Some people walk around feeling fine for days or even weeks before the fever hits. Maybe you're not surviving the plague. Maybe you're just dying more slowly than everyone else. Survivor's guilt. And if you are surviving, what does that mean? Every person you couldn't save, every family you had to tell was hopeless, every child you found dead in a plague pit, they were no less deserving of life than you are. They weren't less careful, less moral, less faithful, less valuable as human beings. They just got unlucky. So why do you get to live when they don't? This question doesn't have an answer, but it follows you everywhere. It's in your mind when you wake up in the morning, when you put on your costume, when you examine patients, when you go to sleep at night. You're alive because of random chance, and everyone around you is dead because of random chance, and there's no justice or meaning or fairness in any of it. You're just the person who happened to win a lottery that nobody wanted to enter. The moral weight. And surviving means that you have to carry the memory of everyone who didn't. You're the witness to their suffering, their fear, their final moments. You're the repository of their stories, their names, their faces. When the plague finally ends, if it ends, you'll be one of the few people left who remembers what it was really like. You'll know things about human suffering that most people can't even imagine. That's both a privilege and a burden that's almost too heavy to bear. Because memory is responsibility. If you remember these people, then you have to honor their memory somehow. You have to make their deaths mean something. But how do you make sense of random, massive, meaningless death? How do you honor the memory of children who died for no reason, families who were destroyed by invisible bacteria, communities that were wiped out by a disease that nobody understood? You don't know. Nobody knows. All you can do is keep doing your job, keep being the witness, and hope that somehow, someday, the memory of this nightmare will serve some purpose. Chapter 19, The Science of Death. Let's take another break from the emotional horror and talk about what you're actually observing as a plague doctor, because your documentation is contributing to one of the first systematic studies of epidemic disease in human history. Without realizing it, you're participating in the earliest form of epidemiology, the study of how diseases spread through populations. Pattern recognition. After months of examining plague victims, you start to notice patterns that won't be scientifically explained for another 500 years. Families that live near the docks get sick first. Areas with lots of grain storage have more deaths. Houses with cats seem to have fewer infections than houses without cats. You don't understand why these patterns exist, but you document them carefully because documentation is one of the few things you can do that might actually help future doctors. What you're observing, though you don't know it, is the ecology of plague transmission. Docks are where ships arrive, bringing infected rats from other cities. Grain storage attracts rats, which means more fleas, which means more plague transmission. Cats kill rats, which disrupts the transmission cycle. You're seeing the evidence of bacterial disease transmission through animal vectors. But medieval medical theory has no framework for understanding what you're seeing. Symptom documentation. You're also creating the most detailed record of plague symptoms that has ever existed. You document the timeline, how long from first fever to appearance of buboes, how long from buboes to unconsciousness, how long from unconsciousness to death. You document variations. Some people develop huge buboes quickly, others have smaller swellings that develop slowly. Some people cough up blood, others don't. Some develop dark patches on their skin. Others die before skin symptoms appear. You document survival patterns. Young adults seem to survive more often than children or elderly people. Some families have one person survive while everyone else dies. A few people seem to get mild symptoms and recover completely. What you're documenting is the variable presentation of a bacterial infection in different human hosts. But medieval medicine interprets this as evidence that plague is caused by different humoral imbalances in different people. Environmental observations. You also notice environmental factors that affect plague transmission, though you don't understand the mechanism. Hot, humid weather seems to make plague spread faster. Areas with standing water have more deaths. Times of year when there are lots of insects seem to coincide with plague outbreaks. You're observing the relationship between climate, insect populations, and disease transmission, but you interpret it through the lens of miasma theory, bad air caused by environmental conditions. Still, your observations are accurate, even if your explanations are wrong. Treatment effectiveness. Most importantly, you're documenting which treatments help and which treatments make things worse. Bloodletting, you notice, seems to make patients weaker and more likely to die quickly. Lancing buboes sometimes helps with pain, but doesn't seem to affect survival rates. Keeping patients isolated seems to prevent other family members from getting sick. Herbal remedies that make patients feel more comfortable don't seem to cure anything, but they do make the dying process less traumatic. You're accidentally conducting the first controlled studies of plague treatment, and your findings, though filtered through medieval medical theory, are surprisingly accurate. Population studies. You're also observing something that won't be formally studied until the development of demographics, how epidemic disease affects different populations. The poor die at higher rates than the wealthy, but not by as much as you'd expect. The wealthy have better food and housing, but they also have more contact with trade goods that might carry infected fleas. Children and elderly people die at higher rates than young adults, but pregnant women have particularly high mortality rates. People who flee the city early in the epidemic have better survival rates than people who stay, but people who flee after the epidemic is established just carry the disease with them. Religious communities that practice strict isolation have lower death rates than communities that continue normal social activities. You're documenting the first systematic observations of how social factors affect disease transmission, centuries before anyone understands why these factors matter. Cross-regional comparison. If you're lucky enough to survive long enough to work in multiple cities, you start to notice regional differences in plague presentation and transmission. Cities with better sanitation have slower disease spread. Coastal cities get infected earlier than inland cities. Cities with larger populations have higher total death counts, but not necessarily higher death rates. Different regions have different traditional remedies, and you can compare their effectiveness. Different cities have different quarantine procedures, and you can observe which ones work better. You're conducting comparative epidemiology without knowing it, gathering data that won't be properly analyzed until the development of statistical methods centuries later. The irony of knowledge. Here's the tragic irony. You're gathering incredibly valuable scientific data about epidemic disease, but you don't have the theoretical framework to understand what the data means. Your observations are accurate. Your documentation is careful and systematic. Your conclusions about environmental and social factors are often correct, but you can't act on your knowledge effectively because you don't understand the biological mechanisms behind what you're observing. You see that isolation prevents disease spread, but you think it's because isolation protects people from bad air rather than because it interrupts bacterial transmission through infected fleas. You see that some treatments make patients worse, but you think it's because the treatments are disrupting humoral balance rather than because they're weakening patients' immune systems. You're like a detective who has collected all the evidence needed to solve the case, but you're missing the key piece of information that would make sense of everything else. And that key piece of information, the existence of bacteria, won't be discovered for another 300 years. Chapter 20. The long emergency. 1 year into the plague, the emergency has become permanent. This isn't a crisis anymore. This is just how the world works now. This is normal life in the 14th century. You've stopped thinking about when things get back to normal because you're starting to understand that normal is never coming back. The world that existed before the plague is gone forever. What's going to replace it? Nobody knows. The new reality. The cities that survive are fundamentally different places than they were before the plague started. Population density is completely different. Neighborhoods that used to house hundreds of families now have maybe a dozen inhabited houses, surrounded by empty buildings that are slowly falling apart. Economic systems have adapted to massive labor shortages. Jobs that used to require years of training are now being done by whoever happens to be available. Social hierarchies have been reshuffled as people from different classes suddenly find themselves in similar circumstances. Political structures have collapsed and reformed around whoever managed to survive and maintain some kind of authority. Traditional family structures have been replaced by makeshift communities of survivors who may or may not be related to each other. And through all of this change, you're still putting on your costume every day and going to work as a plague doctor. Because even though the acute crisis phase is over, people are still getting sick. People are still dying. The plague didn't just disappear. It became endemic, a permanent feature of life that flares up periodically and kills some percentage of the population. Professional adaptation. Your job has evolved too. You're no longer just treating acute plague cases. You're dealing with the long-term health effects of a traumatized population. People who survived plague often have permanent disabilities. Scarring from buboes, lung damage from pneumonic plague, neurological problems from septicemic plague that didn't quite kill them. Survivors often have mental health problems that nobody knows how to treat. Depression, anxiety. what we would now recognize as PTSD, people who can't sleep, can't form relationships, can't function in normal social situations. You're also dealing with malnutrition, because the agricultural systems that fed medieval cities have been severely disrupted. People are eating things they wouldn't have considered food before the plague. And you're dealing with the health effects of social breakdown. Increased violence, increased alcoholism, increased rates of suicide and mental illness. The plague didn't just kill people directly. It created a cascade of health problems that continue long after the acute infection phase is over. The costume evolution. Your costume has become less about protection and more about social function. People need to believe that someone is still in charge, that medical authority still exists, that there's still some hope of professional help when things go wrong. The plague doctor costume provides that reassurance, even when the actual medical knowledge behind it is minimal. You've become a symbol of continuity, a visual reminder that some aspects of civilization survived the collapse. But you've also become a symbol of the new reality. Your costume is alien, frightening, inhuman, a perfect representation of what society has had to become in order to survive. People need the plague doctor to exist, but they also need the plague doctor to be visibly different from normal humanity. Because what you do, what you've seen, what you've survived, that's not something that normal humans should have to experience. Generational change. The children who are growing up during this time have a completely different relationship with death, disease, and social stability than any previous generation. They've never known a world where people don't die randomly and frequently. They've never experienced stable communities, consistent social hierarchies, or predictable economic systems. To them, the plague doctor isn't a symbol of crisis medicine, it's just what doctors look like. The costume isn't strange or frightening, it's normal professional attire. These children are going to grow up to be adults who expect catastrophe, who plan for social collapse, who don't trust that institutions will protect them. They're going to create a very different kind of society than the one that existed before the plague, because they're going to design systems that can survive the kind of massive disruption that you've all lived through. The memory keepers. And you, as one of the few people who experienced both the before times and the plague years, have become a repository of knowledge about how society used to work. Young people ask you questions about life before the plague that you can barely answer, because the differences are so fundamental that they're hard to explain. What was it like when people planned for the future? What was it like when families stayed together for generations? What was it like when communities had stable institutions? You find yourself describing a world that sounds like fantasy to people who've only known the post-plague reality. But you also find yourself questioning whether the old world was actually as stable and predictable as you remember it. Maybe catastrophe was always possible. Maybe the plague just revealed how fragile civilization always was. The burden of witness. Because that's what you've become ultimately. A witness to the collapse and reconstruction of the human society. You've seen how quickly the structures that people take for granted can disappear. You've seen how adaptable humans are when their survival depends on it. You've seen both the worst and the best of human nature under extreme stress. And you carry all of that knowledge with you every day as you continue to do a job that exists at the intersection of medicine, social work, and apocalypse management. You're not just a plague doctor anymore. You're a historian, a sociologist, a psychologist, and a philosopher, all wrapped up in a leather costume that makes you look like a supernatural creature. Because that's what it takes to function in the new world that the plague created. You have to be something more than human, or maybe something less than human. You have to be the thing that can walk through hell and come out the other side, still functional, still professional, still willing to help, even when help seems impossible. Chapter 21. The turning point. 2 years into the plague, something changes. Not the plague itself that's still killing people, still spreading through communities, still defying every attempt at treatment or prevention. What changes is your understanding of what your job actually is. The revelation. It happens during a house call that starts like hundreds of others you've made. A family with a sick child, parents who are desperate for help, a little girl with fever in the beginning stages of bubonic swelling. You examine the child, document the symptoms, and prepare to give the family your standard response. Keep her comfortable, stay with her, pray for her, prepare for the worst. But this time, the father asks you a question that stops you cold. Doctor, can you tell us what it was like before? What life was like when people didn't die like this? And suddenly you realize that this isn't just about medicine anymore. This isn't about treating disease or documenting symptoms or maintaining professional medical authority. This is about preserving the memory of what humanity was like before the world ended. The shift in purpose. Because that's what you've become. One of the last people who remembers the before times. Most of the adults who lived through the pre-plague world are dead. Most of the children who are growing up now have no memory of what normal life was like. You're not just treating plague victims. You're the keeper of a lost world. When you examine a patient, you're not just looking for medical symptoms. You're observing how human society functions under extreme stress. When you comfort a family, you're not just providing emotional support, you're maintaining the human connections that keep civilization from completely disappearing. When you document cases, you're not just keeping medical records, you're creating a historical record of how the world ended and what came after. The responsibility of memory. This realization is both liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it gives you a purpose that goes beyond the hopeless task of trying to cure an incurable disease. You're not failing as a doctor. You're succeeding as a historian and a guardian of human memory. Terrifying because it means that an enormous responsibility rests on your shoulders. If you don't remember, if you don't document, if you don't preserve the knowledge of what came before, then that knowledge might disappear forever. You're not just responsible for the patients you see today, you're responsible for maintaining the continuity of human knowledge and culture across one of the greatest catastrophes in human history, the evolution of practice. So your practice evolves again. You still examine patients, but now you also interview them about their lives before the plague. What did they do for work? How did their communities function? What were their hopes and plans for the future? You still document medical symptoms, but now you also document social symptoms. How are families adapting to loss? How are communities reorganizing themselves? What new social structures are emerging from the collapse of old ones? You still provide medical advice, but now you also provide historical perspective. You help people understand that the current catastrophe is temporary, that human society has survived disasters before, that there is hope for rebuilding even in the darkest times. The plague doctor as cultural bridge. Your costume takes on new meaning in this context. You're not just protected from disease, you're protected from the normal social expectations that would make this kind of cultural work impossible. Normal people can't ask strangers intimate questions about their lives and deaths. Normal people can't observe family tragedies with professional detachment. Normal people can't move freely between different social classes and communities. But the plague doctor can do all these things, because the plague doctor isn't bound by normal social rules. The costume gives you permission to be present at the most private, most tragic, most transformative moments in people's lives. It gives you access to information about how human society functions under extreme stress that no normal person could gather. You've become an anthropologist of catastrophe, a sociologist of the apocalypse, the documentation project. You start keeping different kinds of records. In addition to medical notes, you begin writing down stories. Stories about how families used to celebrate holidays, how communities used to resolve disputes, how young people used to plan for their futures. You record details about daily life that people take for granted, what people ate for breakfast, how they decorated their homes, what songs they sang to their children. You document the process of social change, how new leaders emerge when old authorities die, how new customs develop when old traditions become impossible to maintain, how new forms of art and literature emerge from the experience of mass death. You're creating a record not just of the plague, but of human resilience in the face of catastrophe, the burden and the gift. This work is emotionally exhausting in a completely different way than treating plague victims. When you're trying to cure disease, you can focus on technical medical problems. When you're preserving culture, you have to engage with the full emotional weight of what's being lost. Every story you record is about something beautiful that's been destroyed. Every tradition you document is something that may never be practiced again. Every hope you preserve is from someone who probably won't live to see it fulfilled. But it's also deeply meaningful work because you're ensuring that the pre-plague world won't be completely forgotten. The children who are growing up now will know something about what came before. The societies that emerge from this catastrophe will have some connection to the societies that came before. Human culture will survive because you're making sure it survives. The long view. For the first time since the plague started, you begin to think about the future in terms longer than getting through today. Maybe the acute phase of the plague will end eventually. Maybe the death rates will decline. Maybe communities will stabilize and start growing again. And when that happens, there will be a need for people who remember what came before. There will be a need for the knowledge you're preserving, the stories you're collecting, the cultural bridges you're building. Your work as a plague doctor is temporary. Your work as a keeper of human memory is permanent. The costume may eventually come off, but the responsibility will last for the rest of your life. Chapter 22, The End of the World and What Comes After. 3 years into the plague, you realize that you've been thinking about this all wrong. This isn't the end of the world. This is the end of a world. And something new is being born from the ashes of what died. The new equilibrium. The plague is still present, but it's no longer the overwhelming catastrophe it was in the early days. Communities have adapted. People have learned to live with chronic risk. Social systems have reorganized around the new reality of higher mortality and social instability. This isn't recovery, it's evolution. The world that's emerging from the plague years is fundamentally different from the world that existed before, and there's no going back. Population density is permanently lower. Economic systems are permanently more flexible. Social hierarchies are permanently more fluid. Cultural practices are permanently changed. And people like you, people who lived through the transition, have become permanent fixtures in the new social order, the institutionalization of crisis. The plague doctor is no longer an emergency response to a temporary crisis. The plague doctor has become a permanent social institution. Communities now expect to have plague doctors. They budget for them, train for them, incorporate them into their long-term planning. The costume that once marked you as an emergency responder now marks you as a specialist in managing chronic social trauma. You're no longer just treating plague victims. You're treating the ongoing health effects of living in a post-catastrophic society, mental health problems, social dysfunction, the medical consequences of poverty and displacement and chronic stress, the professionalization of horror. And you've gotten very, very good at your job. You can examine a corpse and determine cause of death with remarkable accuracy. You can assess a plague outbreak and predict its likely course with reasonable precision. You can manage family crises, community conflicts, and social breakdown with professional competence. You've developed expertise in an area of human experience that you hope no one will ever need again, but that you know people will always need. Because catastrophes don't end. They just change form. There will always be epidemics, disasters, social collapses, situations where normal social institutions fail and someone needs to step into the gap. There will always be a need for people who can function in impossible circumstances, who can make terrible decisions with incomplete information, who can maintain some semblance of professional authority when everything else has collapsed. The psychology of permanence. The strangest thing is how normal this has all become. You put on the costume every morning without thinking about it. You walk through scenes of death and suffering without being emotionally overwhelmed. You make life and death decisions with the same casual professionalism that a baker brings to making bread. This isn't numbness anymore. This is genuine expertise. You've become the thing that society needs you to be, a person who can navigate catastrophe with competence and calm. But you've also become something that you never intended to become, a person who is fundamentally different from normal human beings. You can't relate to people who worry about normal problems. You can't get excited about normal pleasures. You can't imagine a future that doesn't include catastrophe as a central feature. You've adapted so thoroughly to crisis that you're not sure you could function in a truly stable, peaceful society. The next generation. The most hopeful thing, though, is watching the children who are growing up in this new world. They're remarkably resilient. They've developed coping strategies, social skills, and psychological frameworks that allow them to thrive in circumstances that would have destroyed previous generations. They don't expect life to be fair, safe, or predictable. But they also don't expect to be helpless in the face of adversity. They've learned to form strong communities quickly, to adapt to changing circumstances, to find meaning and joy even in difficult situations. They're going to build a very different kind of society than the one you grew up in, but it's going to be a society that's designed to survive catastrophe. And they look at you, the plague doctor, not as a symbol of crisis, but as a symbol of professional competence in the face of impossible circumstances. To them, you're not a monster or a supernatural creature. You're a role model. The long legacy. You're starting to understand that the plague doctor costume is going to outlive the plague itself. Future societies are going to face epidemics, disasters, and social collapses that will require people to do what you've done. Step outside normal social categories, take on impossible responsibilities, and maintain professional function in the face of overwhelming horror. And they're going to need a symbol, a uniform, a social role that gives people permission to do that work. The plague doctor costume is becoming a permanent part of human culture, a visual representation of society's ability to respond to catastrophe with professional competence rather than panic and chaos. Centuries from now, when people face crises that you can't even imagine, they're going to put on costumes that look like yours and do work that's fundamentally similar to what you've done. Not because they'll be fighting the same diseases or facing the same specific problems, but because they'll be doing the same essential work, maintaining the continuity of human civilization when normal social institutions fail, the meaning of the mask. So what does the plague doctor mask really represent? It represents humanity's refusal to surrender to catastrophe. It represents the decision to maintain professional standards and social institutions, even when doing so seems pointless or impossible. It represents the willingness to sacrifice normal human experience, normal relationships, normal emotions, normal life, in service of preserving something larger than individual survival. The mask is terrifying because it represents the price that some people have to pay to keep civilization functioning when everything else falls apart. But it's also inspiring because it represents the fact that people are willing to pay that price. The final lesson. The most important thing you've learned is that catastrophes don't break human civilization. They transform it. The The societies that emerge from disasters are different from the societies that went into them, but they're still recognizably human. People still form communities, still create art, still love their children, still hope for better futures. They just do all of these things in new ways, adapted to new circumstances. The plague didn't end human society. It forced human society to evolve. And people like you, people willing to put on the mask and do the impossible work, are the bridge between what was and what will be. You're the living proof that human civilization is tougher, more adaptable, and more resilient than it appears. Even in the darkest times, even in the face of mass death and social collapse, people figure out how to keep going. They figure out how to be human under inhuman circumstances. And that's the real lesson of the Plague Doctor. Not that catastrophes are survivable, but that humanity is anti-fragile. We don't just survive disasters, we use them to become stronger, more resilient, more capable of facing whatever comes next. The mask comes off eventually, but the person who wore it, the person who walked through hell and came out the other side, that person carries the knowledge and strength that the next generation will need. That's the real legacy of the Plague Doctor. Not the costume, not the medicine, not even the historical documentation. The legacy is the proof that human beings can become whatever they need to become in order to survive and help others survive, even if what they need to become looks like a nightmare, even if what they need to become scares children and makes adults cross themselves and mutter prayers, even if what they need to become is something that isn't quite human anymore. Because sometimes not being quite human anymore is exactly what humanity needs. Epilogue. Taking off the mask. 5 years later, the plague is officially over. Not because it's been cured or eliminated, but because it's reached what epidemiologists call endemic equilibrium. It still exists, but it's no longer causing massive social disruption. Communities have adapted. Medical knowledge has improved, even if it's still primitive by modern standards. Social institutions have rebuilt themselves around the new reality. And for the first time in years, there's no longer a daily need for plague doctors. The transition. Taking off the costume for the last time is surprisingly difficult. You've worn it so long that it feels like part of your body. The weight of the leather, the restriction of the mask, the isolation of the barriers between you and the world, these things have become your normal. Without the costume, you feel exposed, vulnerable, too directly connected to other people's emotions. Your face, when you see it in a mirror for the first time in months, looks strange to you. Older, scarred by the marks the mask straps left on your skin, but also somehow unfamiliar. You've spent so long thinking of yourself as the Plague Doctor that you're not sure who you are without the mask. Your voice sounds different too. Without the beak to muffle and distort it, your words sound too clear, too human, too personal. People react to you differently when they can see your face. They expect normal human interaction, normal emotional responses, normal social behavior. But you're not normal anymore. You haven't been normal for years. The readjustment. Trying to function in post-plague society as a regular person is almost as challenging as functioning during the plague as a plague doctor. The skills that kept you alive and competent during the crisis, emotional detachment, professional distance, the ability to make terrible decisions without breaking down, these skills don't translate well to normal social interaction. People expect you to be happy that the plague is over. They expect you to celebrate, to feel relief, to look forward to returning to normal life. But you're not happy, you're not relieved, and you have no idea what normal life even means anymore. You've seen too much, done too much, lost too much of your normal humanity to just slip back into ordinary existence. The trauma of survival, because that's what no one talks about. Surviving catastrophe is traumatic in its own way. You carry the memories of everyone who didn't make it. You carry the guilt of decisions that saved some people and condemned others. You carry the knowledge of how fragile civilization really is, how quickly everything people take for granted can disappear. You know things about human nature, about social institutions, about the relationship between individual survival and collective survival that you wish you didn't know, and you can't unknow them. You can't go back to believing that life is fair, that good people are protected from harm, that society will always function properly. You've seen behind the curtain, and what you saw there changed you permanently. The isolation of expertise. The other plague doctors who survived are the only people who really understand what you've been through. When you gather, and you do gather, irregularly but regularly, you don't have to explain why you can't enjoy normal pleasures, why you don't trust social institutions, why you plan for catastrophes that other people don't even consider possible. You share a language, a set of experiences, a worldview that's completely foreign to people who didn't live through what you lived through. You're like veterans of a war that most people prefer to forget. The ongoing work. But the work doesn't really end. Even though there's no longer a need for daily playgrounds, there's still a need for the knowledge you've accumulated, the skills you've developed, the perspective you've gained. Communities still face health crises, social breakdowns, situations where normal authorities are inadequate and someone needs to step in with expertise in managing impossible circumstances. Natural disasters, famines, conflicts, other epidemics. The specific threats change, but the need for people who can function competently in catastrophic circumstances remains constant. So you find yourself being called in as a consultant, an advisor, a specialist in crisis management. Sometimes you put the costume back on, because people need the visual symbol of professional authority in crisis situations. Sometimes you work without it, because the situation calls for normal human interaction rather than supernatural medical authority. But either way, you're still doing fundamentally the same work, helping human society maintain its functionality when normal institutions fail. The historical record. The documentation you kept during the plague years becomes invaluable as communities try to understand what happened and prepare for future catastrophes. Your medical records help other doctors understand plague symptoms and transmission patterns. Your social observations help leaders understand how communities respond to stress. Your personal accounts help people process the psychological impact of living through mass death. You become a primary source, a first-hand witness to one of the most significant events in human history. Scholars interview you, officials consult you, writers seek you out for stories about the plague years. And you discover that telling these stories is both healing and traumatic. Healing because it gives meaning to your suffering. Traumatic because it forces you to relive experiences that you'd rather forget. The lessons learned. But there are lessons worth preserving, insights that might help future generations face their own catastrophes. The importance of maintaining professional institutions, even when they seem pointless. The value of documenting everything, even when the documentation doesn't seem immediately useful. The necessity of making terrible decisions with incomplete information rather than avoiding decisions altogether, the resilience of human communities, the adaptability of social institutions, the capacity of individuals to become whatever circumstances require them to become, the fact that civilization is both more fragile and more durable than it appears. It can collapse quickly, but it can also rebuild itself in new forms that are adapted to new challenges. The next generation. Most importantly, you help train the next generation of crisis responders. The young people who are entering medical practice now have grown up in the post-plague world. They've seen the importance of being prepared for catastrophic circumstances. They understand that normal medical practice isn't enough. They need to be ready to function when normal social institutions fail. You teach them the technical skills, how to examine patients under dangerous conditions, how to document findings when resources are limited, how to make triage decisions when you can't save everyone. But more importantly, you teach them the psychological skills. How to maintain professional function when everything around you is collapsing, how to make terrible decisions without being destroyed by guilt, how to preserve your humanity while doing inhuman work. The legacy. The plague doctor costume gets stored away in medical collections, museums, archives. It becomes a historical artifact, a symbol of a specific time and place in crisis. But the role itself, the social function of the person who can step outside normal human categories to do impossible work in impossible circumstances, that becomes a permanent part of human society. Future crises will require future plague doctors. They won't necessarily wear the same costume or treat the same diseases, but they'll do the same essential work. They'll be the bridge between normal times and catastrophic times. The people who maintain professional competence when everything else fails, the living proof that human civilization can adapt to any challenge. The final reflection. Looking back, you understand that becoming a plague doctor wasn't just about treating a disease or managing a crisis. It was about discovering what human beings are capable of when circumstances demand the impossible. You learned that you could walk through hell and come out the other side. You learned that you could make life and death decisions with authority and competence. You learned that you could carry the weight of other people's survival without being crushed by it. But most importantly, you learned that these capabilities aren't unique to you. They exist in most people, waiting to be activated by necessity. The plague doctor costume isn't magical. It doesn't give people superhuman abilities. It just gives them permission to access abilities they already had, but never knew they could use. The real lesson of the plague doctor isn't that some people are specially equipped to handle catastrophe. It's that most people are equipped to handle catastrophe if they're given the right tools, the right training, and the right social support. The mask doesn't make you superhuman. It just makes you willing to be human in circumstances where being human requires extraordinary courage, competence, and commitment. The continuing story. And that's why the story of the plague doctor doesn't end with the end of the plague, because catastrophes continue. Societies continue to face challenges that exceed the capacity of normal institutions. People continue to need specialists in impossible circumstances. The specific costume changes, the specific diseases change. The specific social challenges change, but the underlying human need for people who can function competently when normal life fails, that need is permanent. So the plague doctor lives on in new forms, facing new challenges, wearing new costumes, but doing the same essential work, maintaining the continuity of human civilization when continuity seems impossible, proving that no matter how dark things get, There are always people willing to put on whatever mask is necessary and walk into whatever hell needs to be walked into. Because someone has to. And as long as humans face catastrophes, which is to say, as long as humans exist, someone always will. The nightmare behind the beak isn't just the nightmare of medieval plague. It's the nightmare of being human in a world where catastrophe is always possible, where normal life can disappear overnight, where someone has to be willing to step outside the boundaries of normal human experience to keep civilization functioning. But it's also the dream of human resilience, human adaptability, human willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for collective survival. The Plague Doctor is terrifying because it represents what we might have to become. But it's also inspiring because it represents what we're capable of becoming, even when what we have to become looks like a monster. Even when what we have to become requires us to abandon normal human emotional responses. Even when what we have to become is something that children will hide from and adults will fear. Because sometimes being human means being willing to become something that doesn't look human anymore. Sometimes saving humanity requires temporarily abandoning your own humanity. And sometimes the most human thing you can do is put on a mask that makes you look inhuman. That's the paradox of the Plague Doctor. That's the nightmare behind the beak. And that's why, centuries later, when people face new catastrophes that require new forms of impossible courage, they still think of that strange, bird-faced figure walking through the streets of medieval cities. Not because they want to become that figure, but because they need to know that if circumstances require it, they could become that figure. They could put on whatever mask is necessary. They could walk into whatever hell needs to be walked into. They could do whatever impossible work needs to be done, because someone has to. And the Plague Doctor, that terrifying, inspiring, utterly human symbol of professional competence in the face of catastrophe, proves that someone always will. Final thoughts. What this means for us. So there you have it, guys. The real story of the medieval Plague Doctor. Not the romanticized Halloween costume version, not the mysterious supernatural figure from horror movies, but the actual human beings who put on that terrifying outfit and walked into hell every single day for months or years at a time. I want you to think about this story in the context of our own time. Because while we're not facing bubonic plague, we are living in an era of rapid change, social instability, and the constant possibility of catastrophic disruption. Climate change, pandemics, economic collapse, social unrest, technological disruption. The specific threats we face are different from what medieval people faced, but the underlying challenge is the same. How do human societies maintain their functionality when normal institutions are inadequate? Who are our plague doctors? Who are the people willing to put on whatever metaphorical masks are necessary and do whatever impossible work needs to be done? Modern parallels. Think about the healthcare workers who treated COVID patients when we didn't understand the disease and didn't have adequate protective equipment. Think about the first responders who run toward disasters when everyone else is running away. Think about the researchers working on existential risks, the people preparing for climate catastrophe, the individuals who take on the psychological burden of planning for civilizational threats. They're all wearing different versions of the Plague Doctor costume. Maybe not literal leather and beaks, but the same essential protective barrier that allows them to function professionally in circumstances that would overwhelm normal human emotional responses. The personal question. Here's the question I want you to ask yourself. If circumstances required it, could you put on the mask? Could you step outside normal social categories to do work that needs to be done, but that no one wants to do? Could you make terrible decisions with incomplete information, knowing that people's lives depend on your choices? Could you maintain professional competence in the face of overwhelming horror, social collapse, or civilizational catastrophe? I'm not asking whether you want to do these things. I'm asking whether you could do them if they needed to be done, and there was no one else to do them. The hope in the horror. Because here's the ultimately hopeful message of the Plague Doctor story. People can become whatever circumstances require them to become. The medieval doctors who became plague doctors weren't specially selected for their supernatural courage or unusual psychological resilience. They were just regular people who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and rose to meet those circumstances. They put on the mask because someone had to put on the mask. They walked into hell because someone had to walk into hell. They did impossible work because impossible work needed to be done. And if our world requires us to become our own version of plague doctors, if we need to develop new forms of professional competence in impossible circumstances, then we can do that too. Not because we're special, but because humans are special. Because we're the species that can adapt to any challenge, meet any threat, survive any catastrophe, as long as some of us are willing to put on whatever masks are necessary. So let me know in the comments, what masks might our generation need to wear? What impossible work might we need to do? How can we prepare ourselves to be the people who step up when normal institutions fail? And more personally, what would it take for you to put on the mask? What circumstances would motivate you to step outside your comfort zone and take on responsibilities that seem too large, too difficult, too frightening for any normal person to handle? Because the story of the plague doctor isn't really a story about the past. It's a story about human potential. It's a story about what we're all capable of becoming, when becoming that thing is what the world needs from us. The nightmare behind the beak isn't just a medieval nightmare. It's the eternal human nightmare of being called to do more than we think we can do, to be braver than we think we can be, to sacrifice more than we think we can sacrifice. But it's also the eternal human dream of rising to meet that call, of discovering that we're stronger, more capable, more resilient than we ever imagined, of proving that no matter how dark things get, there are always people willing to put on whatever mask is necessary and walk into whatever hell needs to be walked into, because someone has to, and because when push comes to shove, someone always will. Thanks for watching, guys. Hit that like button if this deep dive into historical nightmare fuel was worth your time. Subscribe if you want more stories about how humans cope with impossible circumstances. And let me know in the comments what historical nightmare you want me to cover next. Until next time, remember, the mask is terrifying, but the person wearing it is just human. And that's the most terrifying and most inspiring thing of all.